So now carbon dioxide is transported by three major mechanisms. The first mechanism of carbon dioxide transport is by blood plasma, as some carbon dioxide molecules will dissolve in the blood. This is approximately 7 to 10%, not a large amount by any means, but there is some, more than oxygen at least. The second mechanism is transport in the form of bicarbonate, HCO3-, bicarbonate, and this also dissolves in the plasma. The third mechanism of carbon dioxide transport is similar to the transport of oxygen by erythrocytes via hemoglobin. So although carbon dioxide is not considered to be highly soluble in blood, about 7 to 10% of the carbon dioxide is going to be diffused into plasma. This dissolved carbon dioxide then travels in the bloodstream, and when the blood reaches the pulmonary capillaries, the dissolved carbon dioxide diffuses across the respiratory membrane into the alveoli, where it can be exhaled. A large fraction, about 70%, is transported to the lungs as bicarbonate. Most bicarbonate is produced in erythrocytes after carbon dioxide diffuses into the capillaries and is subsequently diffused into the red blood cells. So in these red blood cells, if you refer back to our blood discussion, we said that carbonic anhydrase is present in blood or on red blood cells. This enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, Ca, helps convert carbon dioxide and water into carbonic acid. This carbonic acid automatically dissociates into two ions, right? They're negative and positive charge, so they're ions, bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. So this formula is depicting just that. One thing to notice here is that if we have bicarbonate, we have hydrogen ions. Thinking back to our chemistry section, hydrogen ions contribute to pH. So the more bicarbonate we have, the more free hydrogen ions we have floating around, and the lower our pH will be of whatever fluid this hydrogen ion is present in. So in this scenario, blood. We'll come back to this idea in a bit. Now, at the pulmonary capillaries, the chemical reaction that produced bicarbonate is reversed. So this bicarbonate and hydrogen ion is converted back into carbonic acid and subsequently back into carbon dioxide and water by carbonic anhydrase. Carbon dioxide then diffuses out of the erythrocytes and into the plasma, where it can then further diffuse across the respiratory membrane into the alveoli and be exhaled. Lastly, about 20% of carbon dioxide is bound by hemoglobin and transported to the lungs this way. It does not bind to iron as oxygen does. Instead, carbon dioxide binds amino acid moieties on the globin portions of hemoglobin to form carb-amino hemoglobin. So I'm going to go back one slide real quick here. So this is the heme portion, this little guy here. These are the globin portions, alpha chain, beta chain. This is where carbon dioxide binds rather than the heme itself. Let me go back now. So this carb-amino hemoglobin forms when hemoglobin and carbon dioxide make contact. So that's exactly what this is. Carb-amino hemoglobin. It tends to have a bluish purple tone to it since it's not transporting oxygen, creating a darker maroon or burgundy color typical of deoxygenated blood. This formula is exactly what depicts the reversible reaction of carb-amino hemoglobin and carbon dioxide in hemoglobin. So, just to touch on the aspect of cellular respiration and how it contributes to gradients or like pressure gradients in blood. Again, cellular respiration is the metabolic reaction that is occurring in body cells. It's a cascade of events. Products from glycolysis are used in the Krebs and citric acid citric acid cycle, as well as in the electron transport chain. And these provide the majority of our ATP for cellular processes. So we have carbohydrates and oxygen that are utilized in these reactions to create ATP and heat and water and carbon dioxide. So again, carbohydrates and oxygen create all of these. We want the ATP, the rest is just byproducts. Well, you can simplify it even more as carbohydrates are nutrients and oxygen is air, and we get energy out of that, and then water and CO2 as waste, and then heat. I didn't put heat as waste because it could be beneficial, as you need to be able to produce your own heat as a endothermic being, but these are exhaled. This water and CO2 is exactly what's exhaled as waste. And then if you want to simplify it even more, eating and breathing gives us energy and waste. So just trying to put things into perspective for you. So the neural regulation of respiration, this looks complex. Just break it down slowly. It is actually very manageable if you can break it up into categories. And so the major brain centers involved in pulmonary ventilation are simply the medulla oblongata and the pons of the brainstem. So thinking back to our nervous system lecture, we talked about the brainstem and how it was just mostly vitals and respiration control. Well, now we are here. The medulla oblongata contains two groups that we're going to call the medullary respiratory center. We have our dorsal respiratory group on the dorsal side and our ventral respiratory group on the ventral side. The dorsal respiratory group is involved in maintaining a constant breathing rhythm by stimulating the diaphragm. So if you follow the arrows, stimulates our diaphragm as well as the external intercostal muscles. It stimulates them to contract and then results in inspiration. When activity in this dorsal respiratory group stops, they are able to relax, allowing expiration to occur. The ventral respiratory group is involved in forced breathing, as the neurons in the ventral respiratory group stimulate accessory respiratory muscles that are involved in forced breathing to contract, resulting in forced inspiration. The ventral respiratory group also stimulates the accessory muscles that are involved in forced expiration to contract. And then the second respiratory center of the brain is called the pons respiratory group, or pontine respiratory group. This apneustic center here, it stimulates neurons in the dorsal respiratory group, and this helps control the depth of inspiration, specifically deep breathing. And then the pneumotaxic center of the pontine respiratory group inhibits activity of neurons in the dorsal respiratory, my mouse keeps disappearing, in the dorsal respiratory group. So this inhibits neurons in the dorsal respiratory group. So sorry, this one here, pneumotaxic, inhibits. And this allows relaxation after inspiration. So the apneustic activates it and the pneumotaxic inhibits it. So basically it is involved in switching between inspiration and expiration. So we're just going to refer to these two centers as the pontine respiratory group in general. Don't worry about memorizing these two. Just know that one is going to activate the DRG and one is going to inhibit or diminish the effect of the DRG. So now for the control of respiration. A lot of stuff going on here. We're going to break it up slowly. The respiratory rate and the depth of inspiration are regulated by the medulla oblongata and the pons, like we just discussed. But these regions of the brain do so in response to stimuli, systemic stimuli in particular, things that are happening in the body. They're responding to those things. The responses are dose-response or negative feedback relationships, in which the greater the stimulus, the greater the response. Thus, increasing stimuli results in forced breathing. Multiple systemic factors are involved in stimulating the brain to produce pulmonary ventilation. So the most powerful factor, keep this in mind, the most powerful factor that stimulates the medulla and the pons to produce respiration is not oxygen concentration, but rather the concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood. So we're starting off on chemical control here. The concentrations of chemicals are sensed by chemoreceptors. And as you recall, carbon dioxide is a waste product of cellular respiration and can be toxic. So a central chemoreceptor is one that is a specialized receptor that is located in the brain and the brainstem, whereas a peripheral chemoreceptor will be one that is specialized and located in the carotid arteries and the aortic arch here. So concentration changes in certain substances, such as carbon dioxide or hydrogen ions, so we can see those here, hydrogen ions and carbon dioxide, stimulate these receptors, which in turn signal the respiration centers in the brain. And in the case of carbon dioxide, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood increases. It readily diffuses across the blood-brain barrier, where it collects in the extracellular fluid. And as we discussed in the transport of carbon dioxide, increased carbon dioxide levels lead to increased levels of hydrogen ions, which decreases the overall pH. Well, this increase in hydrogen ions in the brain trigger the central chemoreceptors that respond to hydrogen ion concentration to stimulate the respiratory centers of the brain. And this triggers or initiates the contraction of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. As a result, the rate of depth of respiration will increase, allowing more carbon dioxide to be expelled or exhaled. And this brings more air into and out of the lungs, promoting a reduction in the blood levels of carbon dioxide, as well as hydrogen ions in the blood. So in contrast, low levels of carbon dioxide in the blood cause low levels of hydrogen ions in the brain, leading to a decrease in the rate of depth of pulmonary ventilation, and this produces a shallow or slower breathing. So carbon dioxide is a major regulator of our respiration. Peripheral chemoreceptors of the aortic arch and carotid arteries sense arterial levels of hydrogen ions in a similar fashion as the central chemoreceptors, but stimulating changes in breathing based on dissolved hydrogen ion content in the blood. These peripheral chemoreceptors are also responsible for sensing blood oxygen levels. If blood oxygen levels become too low, the peripheral chemoreceptors stimulate an increase in respiratory activity. So you can see we have oxygen on here as well, not just CO2 and hydrogen ion concentration. And so if blood oxygen levels become too low, the peripheral chemoreceptors stimulate an increase in respiratory activity. And the chemoreceptors are only able to sense dissolved oxygen molecules, not the oxygen that's bound to hemoglobin. Remember though, the majority of oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. So when dissolved oxygen or dissolved levels of oxygen drop, hemoglobin will release oxygen. Therefore, a large drop in oxygen levels is required to stimulate these peripheral chemoreceptors of the aortic arch and the carotid arteries. And then the hypothalamus and the limbic system, located in the center portion of the brain, these are going to also play a role in influencing the regulation of breathing, and they interact with these respiratory centers similarly to the chemoreceptors. Remember, the limbic system is involved in regulating respiration in response to emotions, pain, and temperature. So, for example, an increase in body temperature causes an increase in the respiration rate. Also, such as like feeling excited or the fight or flight response will also result in an increase in respiratory rate. One thing also to mention here is that there is voluntary control over breathing as well, which initiates in the cerebral cortex and influences the respiratory centers in the pons and medulla, similarly to these other factors that we just discussed. And just as a nice little summary, for chemical control over ventilation, our pH is going to go down, which means our hydrogen ions go up, and this will increase our rate of breathing so as to move more carbon dioxide out of the body via exhalation. carbon dioxide levels go up in the blood, well, same thing. Breathing's going to go up. Well, if oxygen levels drop, we want to get more oxygen into the body, so we're going to also breathe more. And all of these things can be flipped. If the pH goes too high, we'll decrease our breathing. CO2 levels get too low, we'll decrease our breathing. Oxygen levels get too high for whatever reason, we will slow our breathing. And that actually wraps up our discussion on the respiratory system.